Divorce is like getting fired from a job you've always hated. Ah, divorce. Once in a tweet I saw it described as being fired from a job you've always hated, or something along that line anyways. So yup, this story is about divorce and being a kid of divorced parents. Now a lot of kids have parents who are divorced, nothing new or special there. I guess you can say I was young when my parents broke the news to me and my brother. I was in the 5th grade, but honestly I'm surprised it hadn't been sooner. My parents had always fought, and they were always nasty ones, and they always ended with one screaming at the other about wanting a divorce, then stomping away and either locking themselves in a different room or just leaving the house. So needless to say, when they finally divorced, it wasn't a shock. I didn't even cry like most of my friends had done when their parents divorced. I just simply nodded and asked what the custody situation was like. My parents let me and my brother choose who we wanted to live with. I don't know if this was them being kind or using us against each other, as if saying we loved the parent who we decided to live with more than the other. Both me and my brother chose to live with my mom, had visitations with our father. We had our reasons. My father was moving to a different area and we didn't want to change schools and leave our friends behind. That was my brother's reason anyways. I only told my parents that because I didn't want to say the real reason I chose my mom. I was too scared. I wouldn't admit it till years later why it was her I chose to live with. I chose to live with my mom, and even if it was her who was the one moving, I would have still chosen to live with her. My father was a stranger to me, and a scary one at that. I barely knew my dad, and what I did know of him frightened me. I had never been really close with my dad. He was always gone, but that wasn't his fault, and I don't blame him for not being around. He was in the Air Force and was often deployed. I'm actually proud to say I had a parent who fought for our country. I loved my dad, and I still do, but me and my father, well, we have a really complicated relationship, but that's an entirely different story, which will probably be the next blog posts. But back to this story, back to why I chose my mom over my dad. Like I previously mentioned, my parents always had nasty fights, screaming, shouting, door slamming, etc. One day I was home and my parents had come home from grocery shopping and were already in the middle of one of these said fights, but this fight was different. It's one that still lives in my memory, and it would be the first of many things that changed how I viewed my father. It was about 6 or 7 months before they would announce their divorce, and the fighting between them at this point was basically an everyday thing, so I was pretty sick of it at this point. If either me or my brother were in the same room as them, they didn't fight, so instead of listening to them yell at each other, I decided to go downstairs and help them unpack groceries, knowing they wouldn't fight right in front of me. When leaving my room and going downstairs, I made sure to be noisy about it, announcing my presence, so they'd know I was there and stop the yelling. But this being a particular nasty fight, my slammed door and me stomping down the staircase as loud as I could didn't alert them. From a landing on my staircase of the house I lived in at that time, you were able to see the entrance of my kitchen where my parents stood arguing, and just when I go to that landing I realized they hadn't heard me, so I was about to say something, but before any words could leave my mouth, I saw my father hit my mom, and I'm not talking about a shove or push, I really mean, he hit her, hard, right across her face. I couldn't believe my eyes. I stood there frozen in shock. My parents still hadn't noticed me by the time I snapped out of it and crept back upstairs, back up to my room, locking my door behind me. It was at this point that I realized I was sobbing and shaking, and I just crawled into my bed that way, a sobbing and shaking mess. I felt like I was running out of air to breathe and like my heart was beating out of my chest, my thoughts running a million miles an hour, the sounds of my father's hand hitting my mother's face, her sobbing after it happened echoing inside my head, and the echoing of them still arguing from downstairs filled the house. I grabbed my pillow and tried to cover my ears and continued sobbing until I eventually fell asleep. Next thing I know, my mom is gently shaking my shoulder, waking me up, telling me that dinner is ready. I wake up and tell her that I'll be downstairs in a minute. My first thought to enter my groggy mind is, man, that was a really bad nightmare, but thank God it was just that. I go downstairs, and when my mom turns to greet me, smiling and handing me my plate of food, I almost vomit. There on her face is a bruise, exactly where my dad had hit her. I never asked her about the bruise, or any of the other ones that would come after that. I would see my father strike my mother a few other times, and I actually grew to not only fear him, but hate him. It would be years before told anyone of what I witnessed, and when I would come forward about what I saw, that I would also learn that this wasn't the first time he had been like this. I was a kid and didn't know how to handle the situation, so what did I do? I did basically next to nothing. Every time I heard my parents arguing, I always made sure to rush to the same room because I know he wouldn't hit my mom in front of her. So when it finally came to my parents divorcing, of course I chose to live with my mom. I chose her side of things all the time, and I wasn't even upset that my dad was leaving. Even about a couple months after the divorce, when he announced he was moving across the country, I didn't give a rat's ass. I put on a sad face, but secretly I wanted him to be as far away as possible and was glad to hear this news. Now I only had to see him once a year. Throughout the next few years I resented my father. He often used me and my brother against my mom and me, and my dad often fought and would often go months without speaking. One time we went about a year and a half without talking, and I didn't visit him that year like I usually did. In having all this hatred towards my father, I didn't realize that at the time my mom was also using me and my brother against my father, and she had a serious drinking problem as well. It wasn't even after a month after my parents' divorce until her new partner, who also had a drinking problem, was living with us. It'd be years until my parents were able to actually get along, and years before I was on good terms with both my parents. The situation could have been way worse, but it also could have been way better, and it's only one of the many stories have to tell.